All right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Thomas Berman. I'm the director, the Robert M. Conway Director of the Medieval Institute here at the University of Notre Dame. We do many events every year, but this is one of our favorite ones. For the last 6 or 7 years, we've been bringing in a Byzantine Studies Postdoctoral Fellow who come for a year and can work on their scholarly projects while they're here, and then toward the end of their time here we convoke a workshop that involves them talking about their work, but also bringing in some other scholars whose work is adjacent to or connected to that work in some way or another. And this is our 6th annual, I believe, Byzantine Studies Workshop, and I'm glad that you showed up. I mean, I know it's a lot better inside here than outside, but even if you came just to get out of the weather, that's quite all right. I'm going to turn over the floor now to my colleague Alexander Byhammer, Professor of Byzantine History, who will sort of be the MC for today's events. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Tom, and yeah, welcome to our workshop today. And as we just heard, the 6th Annual Byzantine Postdoctoral Fellowship Workshop. This workshop is dedicated to, as you see in the title, Byzantine landscapes of power and resilience. So it is something that is somehow at the intersection of Byzantine history and Byzantine archaeology. It's closely connected, of course, with Tyler's work. He did an amazing dissertation on a region in the Meander Valley and Latmus region in southwestern Asia Minor, where he had a number of very important sites that have a long tradition of historical and archaeological research. And in his dissertation, he tried to sort of combine both historical methods by working primarily on Byzantine archival sources and the results of survey archaeology and excavations in this region. So in this spirit, we will talk today more broadly about, let's say, problems of landscape research space in the Byzantine period with its different methodological approaches. And let me just very briefly introduce to you our speakers today. So via Zoom, our first speaker, after Tyler, of course, who will present his project, our second speaker then will be Marica Cassis, who is Associate Professor of History and Classics and Religion at the University of Calgary. And her work is dedicated to history and archaeology in the medieval Near East, and she did primarily on various medieval excavation sites in Turkey. She mentions primarily the Çatalhöyük excavations in Turkey. And then after that, we have here with us Professor Darlene Brooks-Hedstrom, who is the Mira and Robert Kraft and Jacob Hyatt Associate Professor of Christian Studies at Brandeis University. She worked a lot on monasticism, early Christian monasticism and related research, did a lot of work in Egypt and other places. And our third guest today is Mirto Veicu, who is Assistant Professor of Byzantine Archaeology at the University of Patras. With Mirto, we have a very long collaboration, we can say, dating back to our common time in Cyprus. I think it was about 2010 or so. And recently we also had a joint project on medieval Smyrna, Izmir, where we again tried to do actually something quite similar with what Tyler did in his region, a combination of historical and archaeological research. And she is a specialist in both, we could say Asia Minor, but also in Greece. Her big opus magnum is on Epirus. And so three amazing guests with different perspectives and different experience in archaeological and historical work on settlements in space. I think without further ado, we can now call Tyler. And he will speak to us on Byzantine landscapes of power and resilience. Please.
Let me first take this opportunity to thank everyone who's come, both in person and who are watching online. And let me take even greater thanks of the presenters who have come. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today. I'm very thankful to the Medieval Institute for the opportunity to workshop my research here today. I'd like to give special thanks to Tom Berman, Megan Hall, and Alex Byhammer. A year ago, I defended my dissertation, Mountain Resilience, Settlements on Mounts Latros and Mycale in Middle Byzantine Western Asia Minor. The central question of the dissertation was rooted in an observation by the archaeologist Hans Lohmann as part of the survey of Mount Mycale on the northern side of the Meander Valley. While early Byzantine sites were concentrated at the foot of the mountain, in its flat western area on the coast and the areas close to the coast, there is, in the Middle Byzantine period, a very abrupt retreat into the mountains. Now, my answer to why this very abrupt retreat into the mountains occurred sought in part to challenge the ready-made explanation in a retreat from instability, the idea that people ran to the hills and never looked back. Instead, I found that the move was rooted in the exact opposite, that the period between 969 and 1071 represented one of the relatively secure periods from external threat in the Byzantine Meander Valley. In this period, increased settlement, so I argued, was the result of the activities of two institutions, newly founded large landowning monasteries located higher up on the mountain than any of the monasteries of the previous period, and the large plantations in the valley below owned by the government in Constantinople. My theoretical framework was resilience theory, based on the premise that living in the mountains was a difficult thing to do and thus required greater resilience. This, however, is not the story or the complete story that I'm going to tell today. Instead, I want to start from where I believe I made my most original contribution within my dissertation, but also likely one of its more dubious arguments. Buried in a later chapter, I proposed a method for mapping a boundary description of one of these imperial estates in order to compare this spatial relationship with the archaeological material. But there I also argued that large estates contributed to the resilience of wider settlement patterns, which may be quite true in terms of those mountain monasteries from which they helped finance. But for the majority of the settlement pattern, I have now come to the opposite conclusion. Today I will tell a story about how the landscapes of resilience and vulnerability were navigated in a valley which was heavily exploited in the Byzantine period. One way or the other, I'll change these slides. I contend that the clearest archaeological evidence for large-scale exploitation is the presence of isolated towers. The Meander Valley is full of these towers, surviving in, let's say, different levels of preservation and epistemological certainty. For instance, two towers on the shores of Lake Baffa survive to their fullest height, pictured here at the center and on the left, bottom left. While other towers survive only in the early 20th century archaeological maps, which, without further evidence, may not be Byzantine and may not even be towers, which is what you have here. The purpose of these towers in the Meander Valley has generally been split in scholars between two theories. Scholars such as Wolfgang Müller-Wiener, in his seminal study of the fortifications of Byzantine Ionia, had ascribed them to the defense of the region. The purpose of the towers was to control routes. Now, other scholars, such as Han Lohmann, who I've already mentioned, as the director of the survey of the Milesian Peninsula, questioned this interpretation, preferring to see them as residential towers, akin to donjon or great towers of Western Europe. Scholars working in other regions and other time periods associate towers with the intensification of agriculture. Beyond the comparison, perhaps with maybe early medieval Western Europe, Sarah Morris and John Papadopoulos argued that the early Hellenistic towers were primary markers of the intensification of cash crops and mining, mostly through slave labor. In the Byzantine world, Kostas Morellis, working with the Athenite archival textual material, has shown a connection between towers and agricultural estates. However, he still sees the primary purpose of these towers not to be linked with intensification, but with defense. Today, I would like to argue that the towers of the Meander Valley were not only the centers of estates, but also the marker of the intensification of these estates. One of the mechanisms of this intensification, I will argue, is the control of water. The locations of the surviving Byzantine towers betrays this critical strategy. Towers are found where water, ready supplies of water that is, meet good quality soil. There we go. The critical geological phenomenon at stake here is something called an alluvial fan. The place on the landscape where the water from a mountain stream hits the alluvial valley in the plain. The sediment carried by the water then fans out to create this pattern that's recognizable on the landscape. The fans also portray another topographical reality. The water that creates it comes in speed or volume, which makes it an excellent place for mills. So if you intend to grow, for instance, if you intend to grow grain on a large scale, then thresh it and mill it yourself, the best place to do it is in proximity to an alluvial fan. In the modern and early modern landscape of the Meander Valley, alluvial fans are associated, therefore, with a ready supply of water, and thus have been a good place for a large town or village. The intensification of agriculture made the business of living in the Meander Valley much more difficult for many people. Monopolizing these alluvial fans was one way to do it. Here I build upon the basic observation of Peter Thoneman in his work on the historical geography of the Meander Valley, who pointed out the three-part division between the altitude of the valley. The plain itself, low, completely flat, which floods every winter and is a quite miserable place to live. The hills which frame the valley, a great place for animal husbandry and olive oil production, and the Piedmont zone, where the hills and the plain meet, the ideal place to live. The alluvial fan represents another further step, the ideal place of the ideal place, a critical punctuation of the best places to live among this important Piedmont zone. Okay, so the case study that I'm going to dig into today incorporates the use of two types of survey material. The survey is conducted by archaeologists, and the survey is conducted by the Byzantines themselves, which is what you see here, a delightful illustration of some Byzantines conducting some land survey with some comical captions. Of all the textual sources available to the Byzantine archaeologist, I find the products of Byzantine survey tradition provide a critical comparanda due to their spatial sensitivity. The text in question that I'll be looking at is the Practicon of Adam, the survey of the imperial estate of Alopecae, drawn up in 1073 for the purpose of its donation by the Emperor Michael VII to Andronicus Ducas. The information contained within the Practicon includes demographic data required to collect taxes from nearby villages, the lists of movable and immovable assets, the fees and revenues collected, and calculations for the amount of area the land owned, and a set of boundary descriptions. While much of the Byzantine bureaucratic survey tradition was conducted with the sole purpose of calculating the area of a property, and thus creates descriptions that lack any sense of embeddedness within a specific landscape, the boundary descriptions are quite different. These texts were composed by and for surveyors who needed to be able to read a particular landscape. At the end of the day, Adam, for instance, who is the individual conducting this survey, does not survey from scratch. He's working from an older text, of a previous surveyor, so he has to be able to read it to then check it when the donation is being made to Andronicus Ducas. The difficulty is getting these two sources, the archaeological and the survey texts, to speak to each other lies in our knowledge of which specific landscape the text describes. And so I think my method here is to map out these boundary descriptions. The Practicon of Adam has 4 boundary descriptions. The head property of Baris has 2 descriptions, divided between Baris in the plain and Baris in the hills. We can think back to Peter Thonemann's 3-part division here a little bit. The text also includes the property of Mandracle and the mountainous property of Prinos. While Baris in the plain and Mandracle include measurements, measured in rope lengths, which you can see our surveyors doing this on the top left part of the slide, the boundary description of Prinos and Baris in the hills do not, and are thus much harder to georeference. Today I will show that mapping the boundary description of the imperial plantation of Baris in the plain allows for a richer integration with the archaeological material. Now, just so you get a sense of what these boundary descriptions are like, I've produced here the sort of first phrase, if you want to call it that. And how I've defined this is that they are bound by an individual measurement. So the texts are highly sort of formalized, highly repetitious, and composed of a series of actions that ultimately accumulates in those with measurements with a lovely measurement. Directions, however, there are a few problems. Directions are only cardinal. There's no intercardinal directions as one would find in later naval portolan charts used for seafaring. Therefore, the use of existing features on the landscape to make up for this deficiency in description is common. For the measurements, I am dependent upon Ulrich Stulak's reformed rope length, which is 21.67 meters. This measurement is ultimately derived from a series of treatises on Byzantine land survey from the Byzantines themselves. They were sort of how-to guides for the inspiring Byzantine bureaucrat. Okay. Now, one of the first things I learned as a postdoc here is that I was not the first person to come up with this method of mapping these. And in fact, I discovered the work of Jacques Lefort in the Athenite archives, or his work on the Athenite archives, had developed a method also for mapping these boundary descriptions. And while his method is a little bit more complex, because frankly there's more material to work with in the Athenite material, the basic premise I discovered was largely the same. And the key here to mapping a boundary description is to first compose a schematic map, to understand the description first in its totality. It can be tempting to mine the description for individual pieces of data, but only as a whole do you know what it is. Do you know where those pieces are and how it best relates to the landscape and can be then georeferenced. So here's my schematic map in all of its glory. The individual measurements which we have in the text that I'd shown you I'm now adding them to the text here in green, which proceed around the property. Now, what are we actually looking at? What is this series of lines? What we actually have here are 2 strip fields, basically divided, interrupted in the middle by the presence of a village and by the old course of the Meander River, which causes the fields to have to then change orientation before then touching up against the Meander River itself, with a little sliver of land added on to show how much this sort of territory is also being cut up. Another key feature is the presence of irrigation canal on the left side. It extends all the way out, even though the description you only encounter it twice in 2 places, so it's a sort of a bit of detective work to figure out precisely where this canal goes. Okay, so now that we have a sort of, hopefully a very basic, but some grasp of what this is, the next step with the schematic map is to identify features that can help us georeference it, figure out where in the Meander Valley we ought to be placing this. And here in this property, there are 3 characteristics we can use to figure out where it's located. The first is the distance between the river, the Meander River, and the hills, that Piedmont zone, which is known to be 180 rope lengths, or roughly 3.9 kilometers. This distance comes from a separate set of 4 measurements which Adam used to calculate the area of the property. While the method itself is rather unsound geometry, those individual measurements are very helpful in perfecting the sort of schematic map itself and for georeferencing here. Okay, so the second georeferenceable element is public roads. The text mentions 2 sets of public roads which cross the property. One following that boundary between hill and plain on the southern part of the property, but more importantly, a second one which then butts it heading south, as you're in the very bottom here, up into the hills. There is also another sort of tiny little road that also connects the village of Barbarous with the state mansion of the property. The final characteristic is the defunct course of the Meander River. It's described in the text as the Old River, which is found 91 rope lengths, that is about 2 kilometers south of the Meander, and 79 rope lengths, that's about 1.5 kilometers from the hills, in between the two. The general position and identification of this old course is aided by the fact that the other measured boundary description, that is the property of Mandrake, also includes this feature. In the case of that boundary description, the old river must be less than 60.5 rope lengths, about 1.5 kilometers south of the Meander. In both cases, what's important here is that the old river is south of the current river. This will prove important. Okay, so now we take our 3 characteristics and we apply them to the Meander Valley. Here is the topographical map of the valley, in which I've just included basically a lot of the major cities. This is the sort of course, the river itself in the valley cutting through. All right, so our first characteristic is the boundary between the river and the hills. So I've added this black line in the center here, which marks the boundary between the hills and the river plain itself. I've added a buffer of 3.9 kilometers out, added a little bit buffer on its side, so you have about a 2 kilometer width, and then added in, and marked in red every place where the river crosses this. This becomes our starting point. We then add in the second characteristic, which is the public roads. Here I rely upon the work of Frederick Hild in his work on the road systems of Byzantine Caria. I think we can safely assume that the east to west road in the text must be Hild's Route 2, which ran along the southern side of the Meander Valley. The crux, and I mean this in more ways than one, will be which road bisects it from the south. There are 3 options. Route 3, which goes through Amazon, Route 4, passing through Alabanda, or Route 5, passing through Neapolis and Harpasa. Let's apply our final criteria. Now this is the description of the old river. It is known that the Meander River splits between a northern and southern branch. Here, what I've done is I've kept where the river is still in one piece, it's black, but where the northern branch branches off, it's orange, and the southern branch is then yellow. Now, we know that the northern branch around the city of Priene has been described as the Old Meander. This is even true in Byzantine texts. However, this would contradict our schematic map, which shows that whatever we're identifying as the old river, it must be south of the current river. Instead, I would suggest that a small section of the southern course, which is only discernible through scars on the landscape and oxbow lakes, might in fact be identified with our old river from our text. Taken together, the imperial property of Baris can be identified with the modern town of Kojalar. All right, now let's find out why that matters. Here we can see that the placement of the property, here we can see a satellite image, where I have Kojalar right here. This is it. And we can add in our description here, or our boundary description in red with Baris. I've also added Mandraclay, sort of, this is the other one where it's sort of the same elements are in it. Not as confident of a position, but I think we can roughly place it as well in this general area. And then we add those features back in, a little bit zoomed in so you can see it a little bit better. The canal, the street, where the village of Barbaras is located, where the estate house is. Ooh. Well, no, let's go ahead. Okay. Our first comparison with the archaeological comes from one of the earliest surveys in the area, conducted at the auspices of Theodore Vegant as part of the excavation of Miletus. The cartographer was a Prussian military officer by the name of Karl Leiker. I mention this mostly because I will probably casually reference this as the Leiker map, so you know what I'm talking about. What makes this map significant is twofold, though. One, the archaeological evidences that they recorded that do not survive any longer, but also those features that they record that the archaeologists of the early 20th century did not consider to be archaeological, but instead were the mundane features of the late Ottoman landscape. For the latter, for instance, let us observe the roads that extend out of Kocalar into the valley. These roads and a single canal, the left part, this is a canal sticking out there, reveal analogous, although not identical, a pattern with our boundary description. So let me go back to the satellite view and then add those in. So here, those features, are added in. I argue that the Byzantine canal may be associated with the late Ottoman road coming out of the town, and that the canal on the Leiker map may be associated with this that a canal on the Leiker map was associated with a stream that powered the old mill. This is something from the boundary description of Baris in the hills that I didn't get a chance to talk too much about, which connects this side, of course, the hills. There we go, the old mill. Therefore, as time changes and priorities change, canals can become roads, field boundaries can become canals, and these elements also can pair up. This is even true in the boundary description, where a field boundary and a road operate the same in space. However, the general placement shows a landscape interacting with the difficulties of navigating these scars of the old river, which do tend to hold water and flood, and the opportunities afforded by the converging streams of water flowing through Kocalar. Okay. The archaeological data from our early 20th century archaeologists, also on the Leiker map, is the first indication the landscape was full of towers. However, most of these towers do not survive, and the notation as medieval ruin or just ruin, even with the symbol for tower, means I cannot rule out that these ruins relate to activities in the Beylik or Ottoman period instead of the Byzantine. There is one potential exception. And this exception is potentially the tower in Kocalar itself. Now, the tower itself is mostly the creation of the Ottoman period, and is largely attributed to the work of the Cihanoglu House, a local magnate house of the 18th and 19th centuries. However, it is theorized that the core of this tower, and I would agree, even though this is quite a complicated building, and precisely how this works is a little bit still difficult to piece out, that part of the core of this tower was originally Byzantine. If this is true, I think most likely this backside of it is what could be perhaps Byzantine. I've actually shown you the backside of the tower. The front side's even more beautiful. It's a gorgeous building. It should be pointed out here that the tower does not merely confirm what the Practicon tells us, but instead shows the development of the property after the 11th century. Practica, like the Practicon of Adam, do record the presence of towers within their agricultural properties. The best example is the roughly contemporaneous Practica of the properties of the Marica on the island of Leros, which do record a tower in one of its properties. Quote, tower of the property, built of mortar and brick, 3 stories, having been furnished with doors, with a terrace and the chapel of the most holy Theotokos, end quote. In the Practicon of Adam, however, only on the island of Lade, former island of Lade, is a tower mentioned. This tower here, however, must have been an addition of the 12th or 13th century upon a landscape that was owned by the state in the 11th century. Okay. Now, another key factor that we learn from mapping out this boundary description is the location of the village of Barbarus. The placement of the village in the plain, away from the Piedmont, is a clue that the priorities of this imperial estate did not necessarily favor robust settlement patterns. The Meander Valley, particularly the southern side, likely flooded every winter. This made living in the valley itself quite difficult. More recent archaeological surveys reveal a pattern that places this episode of vulnerability within a context of the longer history of more robust settlement patterns. The survey of the prehistoric archaeologist Engin Akdeniz, along with the archaeological finds of the Ottoman architectural historian Ida Erol, show that Byzantine settlement did conform generally to this pattern of ideal placement that we'd mentioned before earlier and set out by Peter Thoneman. The Piedmont on the boundary between hill and plain was the ideal place to live, and the archaeological evidence presents us with a picture of this being the norm even in the Byzantine period. What Akdeniz likely discovered in his survey were the village cemeteries placed on hills on the south side of the village itself. So here we've got photographs from his report of these hills that would be placed, that were just outside of the sort of Piedmont zone, with the village itself being further south. This is particularly true if some analogy with late Ottoman villages is allowed. The archaeological survey, therefore, is a reminder that not all is gloom and vulnerability in the settlement of the Meander Valley. The cemetery at Chakmar, for instance, it may likely even be associated with the Byzantine village of Olinthos, whose location is known from the boundary description of Baris in the hills, the continuation of the one that we discussed. This village, whose interests lie in managing the forest and the slopes above it, likely proved a more resilient counterpart than its larger village of Barbarus in the open plain. Let us not, though, count out the villagers of Barbarus too quickly. The only buildings that Adam found in the region that were new were in that village. Okay. In conclusion, the Meander Valley was a rich place that made an excellent breadbasket for an empire. The sources discuss this, the archaeological evidence demonstrates this, and the geological, topographical, and hydrological makeup of the valley show how this was done. However, the Meander Valley also had a resource curse. The estates that extracted and removed resources out of the valley, whether destined for Constantinople, Nicaea, or for Patmos, caused a reordering of the settlement patterns. The towers that dot the landscape are evidence of these estates and the incentives of these estates to intensify even at the expense of local populations. Water was the key to this intensification. The tower at Kojalar is where it is because what flowed next to it was this infrastructure of irrigation, this canal. Villages like that of Barbarus were moved from the alluvial fans where a water supply would be more secure into the valley. In short, the intensified extraction made the region vulnerable, requiring those who lived there to have additional strategies of resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. So this was a great exemplary analysis of microhistory. And so now our next speaker is via Zoom, Marica Cassis, and her talk will be on using medieval Anatolian microhistories, so we stay in the microhistorical context, to understand resilience and change.
Just give us a moment.
Everybody can see that okay? Well, thank you very, very much for having me to this. I've just finished reading Tyler's excellent dissertation, and I'm really excited by the parallels that I see between his work and mine. Oh, I see. Hold on. There we go. There we go. Okay, we've got all the technology in, I think, now. And so I'm very excited by the ways that we can think about parallels between the kind of work that Tyler's doing and the kind of work that I'm doing in the far reaches of Anatolia, in perhaps the less glamorous parts of Anatolia. And I really want to think about microhistories with you this morning in a different part of Turkey. I think one of the things that has been very exciting over the last few years is the move to new kinds of methodologies such as environmental archaeology. And one of the things though that I think we have to be really careful is that we don't lose sight of the differences that appear in different sites so that we can then put them side by side and think about them in different ways. So I'm going to actually start in a sort of weird place this morning. I want to actually start by moving us to where I am this morning. And so I'm just trying to figure out which computer works here. I'm on about 3 different computers, so. All right. Pardon me for 1 minute, I'm having a little trouble with my slides. There we go. So I'd like to start this morning with the land acknowledgement from my own university at Calgary, and I have a very specific reason for doing this beyond the obvious. So I'd like to acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, located in the heart of southern Alberta, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. And I owe a great thanks to my colleague, Dr. Craig Ginn, in the religion department here, for helping me start to think through landscapes and microhistory by thinking about how we can compare and parallel our own ancient and medieval perspectives with other ones. So I want to start in rural Alberta before I move back to Anatolia, where we all belong. And one of the things that really affected me when I started to work in central Anatolia was the landscape. So I grew up in rural Alberta, in a town in the middle of nowhere, very much north of Calgary. And Margaret Lawrence, who's was a very prominent Canadian author, described the feeling of being born in one of these towns. She was born in a small town in Winnipeg, and although she spent the rest of in Manitoba, and although she spent the rest of her life mostly in England, she wrote all of her books set in this prairie town because of how much these landscapes affect us as we come into the world. So she says, a strange place it was, that place where the world began, a place of incredible happenings, splendors and revelations, despairs like multitudinous pits of isolated hells, a place of shadow, spookiness, inhabited by the unknown dead, a place of jubilation and of mourning, horrible and beautiful. It was, in fact, a small prairie town. And when we think about small towns, small villages, communities in the Byzantine world, particularly in the isolated locations that places, and places where I, for example, work, where Tyler works, and I think about Dr. Bayhammer's magnificent book here as well. We need to think about those landscapes and those places and how important they actually are to how we understand the development of these sites. And so I just show you a couple of examples from rural Alberta. One of the things that is really significant in this province is understanding how sites developed and changed. And actually, let me just go back to this map. You can see on this map here what are now the highways, but the ones that go north-south used to actually run around the railway tracks, which are now completely defunct. And so many of the towns that existed along those railways have completely disappeared and are, in a sense, just archaeological relics. In other parts they've continued, but they've continued for other reasons, and we can see how they've developed. So on one side here you have the town of Vulcan, which was one of these railway towns, which has largely only survived because they've played up the Star Trek reference. And you can actually go to Vulcan and see a replica of the Star Trek Enterprise. And then Devon, which was an oil boom town, and which was in fact the town where I grew up. But the stories inherent in these towns don't just go to the railway, they don't just go to the oil boom. Just as in the Byzantine world, in these rural communities, the things ebbed and flowed in these communities. And so we have to think about the stories as well in how each one of these places develops. And so one of the things I want to stress is that sometimes when we're thinking about this material, we don't always think about all the stories. And so in the area where Vulcan is, the Kainai Nation is now located, and in the area just north of Devon, we have the Enoch Nation in Treaty 6, I think. Each one of these, when we look at old photographs, we get sort of stereotypical colonial photographs of them, but they are today very vibrant communities of their own, with their own stories. And so when we sort of ring back and think back about these areas that we're thinking about in Anatolia, one of the things I want to stress is that we're looking at a multiplicity of stories that are part of these microhistories, and it's not just about it's not just environmental change and its effect, it's not just about sort of the big narrative, but it's also about the individualized stories of using the landscapes and how the ebbs, these areas ebbed and flowed. So we move here to talking, back to Anatolia where we belong. One of the things that I've always found very frustrating in looking at rural Anatolia is that the imagery of it is very standardized. So we have images of people dealing with crops. We also have very clear saints who were situated in Anatolian peasantry communities like Theodore of Sicyon. And so we have a sort of standardized set of views, but even these present stories that I think need to be situated in the landscape and the communities. We then have the so-called end of the Byzantine period in Anatolia, which is always presented through the lens, or quite often presented through the lens of Manzikert and the destruction of the Byzantine communities. But as I'm going to talk about that, just as when we look at local communities and rural environments in the States or Canada, isn't the entire story, because it isn't necessarily a story of destruction, it isn't a story of abandonment, there is change. So we're looking at communities that change, that are resilient, and that are needing a rethink. And so, I think very much about Tyler's observations that we have long held on to this idea that everybody runs to the hills to hide, but in fact, the complexity here is that more often than not, this is happening in the Middle Byzantine period. But the problem in Anatolia is in some ways very problematic because it starts in the colonial period with how things were perceived. And so one of the first steps we need to do is to deconstruct the colonial approach to rural Anatolia. So I show you here an image from the site of Alishar, and this was dug by Hans Henning von der Osten in the 1920s, the late 1919s, and then into the early 1920s. And here you have him in practically his pith helmet and boots, staring off towards Kirkenes. One of the problems that we see in central Anatolia is there's such a limited amount of material that has been excavated that we are at the mercy of sort of standard surveys of the region, many of which were done very early, and we are at the mercy of what little excavation was done, and it was often done in aid of trying to discover the Hittites. But what that has meant is the publication of it has reinforced this old narrative that these were people who ran off to the hills. When von der Osten published the material from Alishar-Hoyuk, which is just down the road from us, and Chadar-Hoyuk, the site that I run the medieval excavations at, is in fact part of this larger permit. When he published the material from Alishar-Hoyuk, he published it in half a volume, and it was all pieced together as Roman to Ottoman. So there was very little separation. Most of the stuff was just disposed of as not being very exciting. The excavations were, for the time, fairly good, but this material was deemed unimportant, sort of, the sort of sad vestiges of the community. But when you actually travel through this region, you can see that it's much more complex than that we have Byzantine material from villages to the city, and that there's been very little understanding of the microhistories of this region and what they tell us about Anatolian development in this area. And so we're having to go back and reconstruct and reconsider some of the material from the colonial period, which I believe has really led to a sort of abandonment of this area. And it's not the only area. One could say the same thing about the Syriac churches in eastern Anatolia. So when we're using microhistory out here, we're really having to think about things where we simply don't have the kind of resources that even somebody like Tyler has, where we're looking primarily at what we get, but also landscapes, and we're thinking about this in terms of how people could have used these landscapes. So I always go back to Emily Kurtz's discussion of this for Near Eastern history, much earlier Near Eastern history, where she says that an analogy would be that of attempting to write the history of Britain using worm-eaten records from a monastery, a civil service department, and a gentleman's private study, and perhaps a section of the British Library, all separated by centuries from one another. And so when we're looking at Anatolia, we're often looking at about 1,000 years of history, but we're piecing it together from the excavations, and we have very little to compare it with and almost no historical records. So I've been very influenced by the Icelandic school of microhistory and what they call singularization, which very strongly suggests looking at things in their individual contexts. I don't agree with their, they've got a full-on sense that you don't then compare it, and I'm not sure that I agree with that, but I do just want to stress that this is what has really influenced the way I think about this material. I've also, of course, been heavily influenced by the resilience model, and here I have the standard image from Gunderson and Halling, 2002. And I've worked with several other scholars, like Neil Roberts and John Haldon on this. It's really influenced the way I think about these communities as ebbing and flowing, and again, this goes back to my own background in rural Alberta. thinking about these communities as moving in a sort of cycle of use as the landscape use changes. So if we move to the region where I excavate, I have here the map from the Tabula Imperii Byzantini, and this whole region is very much full of small Byzantine sites. Some of them are recorded in here, some of them are not. Very interesting, there are some notable omissions from here. But when you put together this work as well as other material, we have a real sense that the whole area is very, very complex and needs to be considered much more thoroughly in terms of putting these microhistories next to each other. And then next to it is an aerial shot of our site. Now, I put this because I want you to really understand how different what we're doing here is from the kind of work that Tyler's doing. And yet the same arguments were applied early on. When I first came out to the site, it was run by people worrying about the Hittites and the Chalcolithic people, and these are my colleagues and I love them, and they came out, I came out for the first time as a grad student, and they asked me to deal with the medieval stuff on top because they wanted to get to the other stuff. And I stood there and I thought, uh-oh, because we're gonna be here for quite a while, because there is so much more there, and that's all worked out just fine. I've been there for 20 years. But we're still dealing with the narrative of poor peasants hiding on a hilltop. I don't know how much hiding they could actually do, since you can see it from everywhere, without really thinking through what's there. And so I want to take you through what we've determined at Çatalhöyük, and I'm happy to say that our C14 dates have finally come in, and so I'm able to talk with a little more authority about the dates for what we have here. We're in the process of publishing that, and so this is exciting for us because it really does show a different kind of perspective, but the dates very much parallel the kind of work Tyler's doing. So here we are located east of Ankara. We're very close to the major site of Cassis. This is an old photo. This was a man-made lake that has since disappeared, but this is just an old photo to sort of show you how we sort of stick out in this prairie landscape. Now we have two areas of excavation. I'm going to just talk about the mound today for the interest of time, but just to give you a sense, on the terrace we have habitation that goes right from the Romans straight through to the Seljuks. We have Imperial Roman C14 dates. This image just shows you how complicated the stratigraphy is because right next to the arrow are C14 dates that are Imperial Roman, and then at the very top we have reused by the Seljuks. So you can see just how complicated this is. It's a house or a village complex. We've only excavated a tiny, tiny portion of it. We're coming back to that this summer, and we'll have more data after that. But it was built in the Roman period, reused in the late Roman period, continued in use through the early Byzantine period, and then was restructured. This is the Roman or the late Roman period, restructured and reused in the middle Byzantine period, and then we seem to have some Seljuk appearance and reuse of the structure, probably for seasonal usage in the 12th, 13th century. But I want to look specifically at the mound today to talk about the parallels and the differences that we see in relation to the work that Tyler's doing. Here's a somewhat somebody standing in the middle of it. I apologize for that. Drone photo of the mound. We've now uncovered most of the mound that is giving us data. And here's just another shot of it. What we find on the mound is actually very interesting. There's very little early occupation on the mound itself. So we have what appears to be a Roman or a late Roman room that sits off the side. It probably had some sort of ceremonial function because it was full of really exquisitely painted bricks. What happened there is very difficult to say, but it seems to be the only piece of the mound that was used in the Roman or the late Roman world. They had a monumental entrance next to it, but nothing on the mound dates to this period after that. And in fact, we have here just a clear layers of dirt that were packed down by the Byzantines behind it when they came in and built the fortifications. So we actually know that between the, say, 1st century and the 8th century, nobody is actually using this mound except for this tiny little portion. So we cannot claim anymore that the peasants are using this as a place of safe storage or to hide or anything like that. There is absolutely no evidence except for this one room which seems to have ceremonial function. And then there's a monumental entrance to it. So there's something going on here, and I still have very little idea what it is. What does happen, and this we can now talk about in terms of clear radiocarbon dates, is that in the period after about 950, in exactly the period where we're watching, local elite families take control of the area, we do find a major fortification put in place here. The ceramics are really difficult. They're all coarse wares. We have virtually no fine wares, so we're really dependent on those C14 dates, which we can now compare to the courseware to put together a sequence of courseware for the region. But what we see here is a very clear use of a site for that Middle Byzantine period. Just a couple more shots of the fortifications. These were built on a flattened land. In places where it dipped down, they filled it with dirt, and in other places, these fortifications, in fact, were plunked down right on top of the Iron Age. So we found a very nicely dated Chemenid period post right underneath. So there's a little bit of Hellenistic, but no Roman, no late Roman. They put in a storage building, and you can just see here there is you can just see the edge of the mud brick stable on the edge of it. We have a forge, and we have a lot of evidence up here for processing of grains. There's drainage, there are storage pits. Obviously, they're using this for minor defense, but not in any major way. There's also nobody living up here. This is very much a place for processing and storing material and keeping it safe. And so we have in this period between about 950 and the early 11th century, an area that is being utilized either by a local community below where the terrace is, or a monastic enclosure, and we have some speculation about a monastery in the region, but it's very difficult at this point to say for sure. But at any rate, this is being used as a place to keep this material safe and secure. We then start to see the beginning of the 11th century becomes a period where things do start to change, and you can see here they add on to the fortifications. These are not fantastic walls. They seem to be doing it a little bit more of a hurry, but in adding on these walls, they're adding on extra rooms, and they seem to be moving more towards creating a more defensive enclosure. This makes sense alongside the larger historical narrative, but it doesn't really suggest they're in any immediate danger. They're putting this together, but they seem to carry on for another 30 or 40 years in pretty good shape. By about 1040, we start to see that there's a little more concern for what is actually happening here. We start to find, we've got 2 seals from this period that suggest they're starting to have some contact with a local imperial official. It may be that at this point they're starting to prepare for the appearance of the Celtics. It may be that there's a small military encampment here. And at this point, we also know that there are a number of Norman mercenaries who've broken away from the military and are sort of marauding through the area. So it may be as simple as that. By this point, they do start to prepare for something. And so we see them putting up mud brick houses up on the top, and they start to block off some entrances. We get what we think is a small chapel up here, which suggests that they are unable to get to wherever the church is. And before anybody wants to ask me that, I have no idea. So I'm the only Byzantine site with no church. You can see here this is what it looked like when we excavated it. This is what it looked like at the beginning. There was a major conflagration on one side. Walls were pushed in, they blocked entrances. But what we also know is that there were not a lot of people there. They seem to have left the site. We have this mid-11th century seal that was found in the storage room next to the stable. The stable was full of primarily cattle, which died specifically in this. They seem to have been left up there. The population fled, probably hoping to return, and they did not. And the cattle died on the hoof, locked in this stable. Mixed in with the cattle was one body and a couple of dogs. We did find another couple of bodies on the other side of the mound and some Byzantine armor, suggesting that they had left a couple of people to guard it and maybe some people to deal with the animals, but that the population never returned. So what happened to this population remains an open question. We have and I say I've taken out the next slide, but we have always, we initially assumed this had to do with the Seljuks' arrival, and that is still a possibility, but the fact that the animals were left and that people were killed does suggest another possibility, and I think a stronger possibility, which is that these were probably, this was probably the result of one of these groups of marauding Normans. They seem to have had a lovely banquet and then moved on. And we did find in the remains a couple of artifacts which suggest a Western connection. And these are not processional crosses, my apologies, St. Peter's crosses. So it is unlikely that the Seljuks were, were the instigators of this. And so we then had to start rethinking the microhistory of the Seljuks in this region. And what we discovered is that by the late 12th and early 13th century, the Seljuks appeared to be, and I'm using the term Seljuk very loosely, I really mean here Turkic pastoralists, are using the site probably for seasonal work. They clear out the west side of the mound. They don't worry about the rest of the mound. They put up a couple of windbreaks, so we get very clear evidence for them here. There's some beautiful metal objects that clearly have connections to probably northern Mesopotamia or Syria. This weird little building that was originally Roman, that was built into the Byzantine fortification, they don't use it, but they do seem to clear up a lot of stuff, toss it over the side. And so we find a whole bunch of broken metal objects that seem to be just dumped there by this population that are of no use to them. And then just to finish up, we find this one Celtic period burial, which is right down at the very bottom of the mound. This is the only proper burial we have excavated to date. It's the only one we've found. And if you look at this skeleton, what we see here is something that really suggests a much more complicated history to this area. This skeleton is of a woman. She was probably about 40. She's buried pointing towards Mecca, but she's also buried with a small pot on her hip, and the rock you see on her neck is deliberately placed. So there's something going on here with a local community that is somewhere caught between old beliefs from Central Asia and Islam. Who this woman is a difficult problem. But we're seeing here new questions that need to be asked. And so, just to end the presentation, I want to just take you up to the very top of the hill, looking down over our site, which is a small mosque today. There's a small graveyard that seems to be mostly women and children, and the graveyard hasn't been used in a very long time, but there is a tiny little private mosque up there. And when asked about this site, the locals have always said it's something that's associated with the 40 Seljuk martyrs. And this is an interesting question, who do they mean? But it is also the region where the 40 martyrs of Sebastia are, and so it's very possible we see a folk tradition coming down in the region that's connected to Sebastia, which is modern Sebas, in the region that's then incorporated into the Islamic tradition. But the whole region then presents a very long story that goes from, of course, the pre-Roman period, but the Roman period straight through to the Ottoman period, with small breaks, but not enormous ones, as they continue to use this landscape. And so as we parse out the pieces of landscape, we start to get a much more complex narrative about the small rural communities of Anatolia. And in doing these micro-histories of the region, I think we get closer to seeing the population as they actually existed in this region. So with that, I will end up. I just wanted to, again, give a special thanks to Dr. Craig Ginn, who is our Indigenous scholar of religion. And working with Dr. Ginn has really made me think about privilege and colonialism and how we think about land and who it belongs to and how it's utilized. And so I owe him a special thanks. And then many thanks to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which has funded this research. Thank you very much.